All right, it looks like everyone's been able to join, so we'll go ahead and get started, I think. Anna, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks everybody for being here. Hello and welcome. My name is Anna Rue and I'm a folklorist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, serving as the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures. I'm excited to be co-hosting today's presentation with my friend and fellow folklorist, Marcus Cederstrom, and today's presentation will feature our friend and colleague here at UW-Madison as well, Nathan Gibson, who'll be presenting Finnabilly, American Roots Music and Rebellion in Finland. For those of you who are joining us for the first time as part of the second year-long and annual FinnFest, we welcome you. I want to open by thanking all of you for being here and thanking FinnFest for organizing this great series of events throughout 2022. Today is the first series, or the first event in that series, and we've been really proud to work together with our FinnFest colleagues to bring you an enjoyable and interesting set of talks and performances. Thanks are also due to the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures here at UW-Madison and the Sustaining Scandinavian Folk Arts in the Upper Midwest project. You might also know us as Nordic Folklife. We have, it looks like 95 people here so far joining and supporting FinnFest in this virtual series, which is really exciting to see. We've been making some links available to all of you so you can follow up for more from FinnFest and our Nordic Folklife series and the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures. This is a live program held on the Zoom webinar platform, which means that the presenter cannot see or hear the audience, and audience members can't see or hear each other. We will have time for questions at the end though, and you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask your question. I'll then share questions with the presenters and we'll go on in that have some interaction at the end. We'll be recording today's session and sharing it through the FinnFest website and through the YouTube channel for the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures. And those links will be shared after the program when those presentations go live. As well, as we welcome everyone to this series of webinars, I'd like to ask that we take a moment to think about place. I work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which lies on Ho-Chunk land. I mention that to acknowledge where we are and to acknowledge that we can't tell the story of immigration and history and heritage of family and friends without understanding where we came from, where we are, who came before us, and who will come after us. As we gather from places across the country and the globe, we invite you to take a moment to think about the people who are in the place you currently live. Think about those who are kin to you and those who aren't. Think about how the land may have changed over time, how it's changing in front of you and with you. These connections have helped shape who we are and helped shape the places we live in today. So we'd like you to reflect on that for just a moment, because the ideas of history and heritage, immigration, kinship, and place are part of what we talk about throughout these series. And we hope that these reflections will help bring a deeper connection and understanding to our conversations. Now I'm going to hand it over to Marcus to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Nathan Gibson, and Finnabilly, American Roots Music and Rebellion in Finland.
Thanks, Anna. Super excited for Nate to be here and presenting. Nathan Gibson is a folklorist, an ethnomusicologist, an amazing musician, and he's also our co-worker as the Audio-Visual Preservation Archivist for the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So at UW-Madison, Nate runs the Audio Preservation Studio at the Mills Music Library, which is an amazing partner, and we'll drop the link in the chat, but you absolutely need to check out some of the incredible things that they're working on over there. Nate also works then with Anna and with me on the Sustaining Scandinavian Folk Arts in the Upper Midwest project and the Nordic Folklife project. In addition, he's the author of the award-winning book, The Starday Story, The House That Country Music Built. And he recently completed a really amazing musical project called Nate Gibson and the Stars of Starday, in which he recorded 24 songs with 14 stars from Starday Records. and also some wonderful music videos that we'll link to in the chat as well. On the other side of the Atlantic, Nathan Gibson was a guest researcher at Tampere University between 2012 and 2013, at which time he was researching his dissertation on American roots music in Finland. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that. At the same time, he was touring, he was recording with several Finnabilly bands. He's visited more than 50 cities in Finland. He can sing at least 2 songs in Finnish. He's a big fan of Eero Aarnio's Ball Chair, but is still not a fan of Salmiakki, despite many attempts. So we're super excited to have him here today. Super excited for you all to be here with us. And like Anna said, there will be some time at the end for questions, for chat, and you can use the Q&A button at the bottom, or just ask your questions in the chat and we'll make sure to get to all of that. But with that, I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Nate and let him take it away.
Thank you so much, Marcus and Anna, very much appreciated. And thank you to FinnFest for having me. This is exciting. I am going to share with you a little bit of Finnabilly music with you today. And I've been researching this music for about a decade. I wrote my dissertation on the subject, and it's fun to be able to present some of that research and some of that music with you today. I'm going to be reading because I did think I should write this out. So I'll be kind of looking at different screens, but I'm with you in this respect. And some of you may be unfamiliar with the term Finnabilly, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time defining that term, playing some of my favorite examples, but I'll also tell you a bit about how the music happened in Finland and why I think it's important to talk about it today. A bit of background, short background, because Marcus gave a wonderful introduction there. But I was a graduate student at Indiana University studying folklore and ethnomusicology when I was told I needed to be fluent in 1 language or proficient in 2 languages to graduate. And prior to that, I'd only studied Spanish, and an advisor of mine suggested that I pick a less commonly taught language, and so I chose Finnish. And I have joked before that I was just looking for the easiest language there is to learn. But in truth, I was interested in Finland for a multitude of reasons, but primarily because it shares an 800+ mile border with Russia. It was part of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. It was that official divide between East and West, a religious border, a disparity between wealth and poverty. It's a religious battleground. It's a political battleground, an economic battleground, and more importantly, from my research interests, it's a cultural battleground. So after a year of language courses, I was fortunate to get funding from the Center of International Mobility to go to Finland and study Finnish language and culture at Vaasa University. I didn't really plan too much ahead, but I arrived in Helsinki in 2011, a couple days before the course began. And this slide here, let's see if I push that button. Oh, I see. Maybe I can, there we go. There it is. If I push that button, represents my first couple days in Finland. The first day that I went to Finland, I arrived on a Friday in the summer, which turns out is American car night. And they're cruising up and down the waterfront, just a lot of American cars. A friend of ours had a 64.5 Ford Mustang, and we went cruising up and down the waterfront, hundreds of American car enthusiasts. I heard a rockabilly band. I met the US ambassador to Finland, my first night there. And I heard a rockabilly band singing in English, which I thought was interesting. And I saw a lot of Confederate flags, some on cars, some on Helsinki city buses advertising Helsinki Rockabilly Week coming up. And it kind of had me a little curious about what was going on. And the next morning I stopped at the Guffen record shop in Sornainen, and I was hoping to sell some of the Starday books that had just come out that I had written. And I saw Pete Hawkinen there, who was in the lower left corner. I had briefly met him at a Green Bay Rockabilly Festival about 5 years earlier. And he was super kind and welcoming. Finland couldn't hope for a better ambassador. He set me up with a book signing event for my Starday book. He got me a recording session with a well-known Finnish rockabilly band, the Barnshakers. He also called the Helsinki Rockabilly Week promoters and got me a slot as a headliner for one of the closing nights. And at that show, Yle E, the Finnish broadcasting channel, public broadcasting station, came and filmed the show. And I was included in part of a 6-minute documentary on the Finnish rockabilly and American car revival, which we can put a link to at some point. And I just didn't really know what I had stepped into, but I was pretty surprised by it all. It was sort of overwhelming. So a couple of weeks later, I went to a country music festival in Orimatala to see Ikarilainen and the Polkabilly Rebels and Jussi Soren and the Groundbreakers. And then I went to Kaustinen to see Finnish folk music. And what I heard instead was one of Finland's great rock stars, Eero Raitinen, doing an electric blues set and singing in English. And it was all just a little bit surprising. I was only in Finland about 8 weeks, but when I returned to Indiana, I thought I should probably do something with this trip. And I started taking Finnish language and Finnish history, a Finnish music readings course, a Kalevala course, just anything I could take that was about Finland. And I proposed a dissertation on American roots music in Finland. I got a 10-month grant from the Center for International Mobility, and I returned to Finland as a guest researcher at Tampere. And that's sort of the background for why we're talking about this today. So the question is, what is Finnabilly? A lot of folks have asked me, so I shall define it. There are inherent problems with defining things, and particularly genres of music, because whenever you define something, you're really setting boundaries of who's included and who isn't included. And that's not just kinds of music, but actually people and musicians and fans and groups. But it's nuanced. But for today's presentation, I'll use the term Finnabilly to describe two things: a genre of music and a music community in Finland. The term Finnabilly is a hybrid of Finnish and rockabilly. And for anybody uncertain with the term rockabilly, which is also nuanced, it's an early predecessor of rock and roll, originating in the mid-50s, blending hillbilly music with up-tempo styles, perhaps best personified by the early music of Elvis Presley. And the term Finnabilly was first used on a Finnish compilation LP put out by Rebel Records in 1982, and has subsequently been used by various music labels and bands and concert promoters, record collectors, to describe rockabilly and its subgenres emanating from Finland. And in recent years, the term Suomabilly or Suomi rockabilly is sort of an interchangeable term. So I mentioned Guffen Records. That was the store I went to first learn about this stuff. And this slide here is from the Guffen Records web store that I took a screenshot of yesterday. And music taxonomies are probably most important to music retailers. They sort of guide the consumer in a shop to the section that they might be looking for. And there is a Finnabilly section in the Guffen's physical store and also on the online store, where you can see over 400 items are for sale, including that cool Hal Peters Western Swing CD up there, and a lot of subgenres to the left that are included. And the term has been used on various releases and by bands, and but mostly by Finnish stores to denote Finnish rockabilly and related genres. And while I was living in Finland from 2012 to 2013 doing dissertation research, I volunteered at the Guffen Record Shop twice a week, and I got to see this Finnabilly term in a retail shop in practical use. And I realized it was more than just a group of music genres huddled together, but it was also a group of musicians who all knew each other in Finland, who play in multiple bands, who largely grew up together at the same time, and share an affinity for a similar kind of music. And I began to think of Finnabilly as a folk group, sort of like-minded people who stuck with music long after it was left from the mainstream. And that idea was sort of reinforced when I noticed that the most utilized online reference for live shows, American roots music shows in Finland, was Tapio Väisänen's Finnabilly Gig Guide. And he operated the site since the late 90s until a couple of years ago, updating it weekly with gigs throughout the entire country, which included honky tonk and rockabilly and bluegrass and rhythm and blues and assorted genres that he felt influenced rockabilly or had an association with 1950s American roots music. And this is a slide from Tapio's gig guide on the day of my Helsinki Rockabilly Week performance, which is interesting to note that in Finland, there were 14 other Finnabilly shows on the same day, which shows you just how popular the music in Finland was, in part because Finland is such a small country, 5.5 million folks around there. Folks would normally be drawn to maybe related but distinctly different genres or scenes, and they're brought together under this sort of umbrella term, Finnabilly. So bluegrass bands are playing the same shows as rhythm and blues bands, and honky-tonk bands are playing at festivals with doo-wop groups and rockabilly bands and western swing ensembles. And while they may sound different, they're all singing in English, and they are all playing a style of music that originated in the United States around the 1950s. So there's strength and more money to be made by grouping these genres together. As popular as Finnabilly was at this moment in time in 2011, and it seemed to be going through some sort of a revival. There were numerous reissues from various record labels and new books about that era that were coming out while I was there. But I quickly learned there was a time in Finland when Finnabilly music was the most popular music in Finland. Between 1977 and 1981, American roots music, and particularly rockabilly music, reached a popularity zenith as the rockabilly albums dominated national charts with Finnish groups like Teddy and the Tigers, Buck Jones and his Rhythm Riders, Johnny and the Dodgers, and Rockola, and American groups like the Stray Cats and Ray Campy, British groups like Crazy Coven and Matchbox. They were all charting higher than U2, Prince, ABBA, Michael Jackson, Donna Summer, Bob Dylan, the Bee Gees. It's an interesting phenomenon to look at for a lot of reasons. But one way to note the level of popularity is by looking at these charts and noting that the Finnish rockabilly group, Teddy and the Tigers, had the #2 and the #3 albums in Finland at one point. But it's slightly more fun to look at the popular trade magazines of the day than it is to just look at the charts. These colorful gems from my collection include some amazing ads. And I do think, let's see, I had a note here and I should have mentioned it. How did I skip that note? I wanted to put a note in here about the Confederate flag, a sort of a warning shot about the Confederate flag, because through this presentation, you will see the Confederate flag several times. And it's a trigger for many, and it certainly was for me when I first encountered it throughout Finland. And there's an entire chapter of my dissertation about the Confederate flag in Finland. I think it's interesting. I think it's important. It's probably the most important thing that I researched and talked about, because it's a way to get to talk about music and race and the sort of changes Finland has been going through since the Cold War. But that's not today's presentation. So you will notice a lot of folks, as the rock and roll boom hit in the 70s, the Confederate flag was a big part of that. And for many, it meant rock and roll music at the time. And in the last 5 years, as rockabilly festivals across the globe have banned the Confederate flag, Finland is going through a real debate and dialogue about should the flag be kept and should it be abandoned. A lot of people are addressing that. So it's still relevant and interesting, just not the talk for today. I don't know how I missed that note. But Suosikki, the magazine that you see here, was the most popular youth magazine of the era and had a circulation around 100,000, with nearly every issue in the 70s featuring the Confederate flag, and 50s film and music stars. Jyrki Hämäläinen was the editor and one of the most important promoters of the 50s revival, constantly promoting Elvis and James Dean and Eddie Cochran and others. And Jani Salmi, in his book Kun 50-luku tuli takaisin, which is translated to When the 50s Came Back, estimates that between 1978 and 1982, there were about 10,000 Finnish youth involved in this Finnabilly movement. Close to 200 bands played American roots music in Finland, and several Finnish albums were certified gold and sold upwards of 25,000 copies. The Stray Cats got their first ever gold record in Finland. Artists like Johnny Cash, Sleepy LaBeef, and Charlie Gracie, American acts, were touring Finland in '81. And Ray Campy, who at the time was a school teacher in California, found out that his album was charting higher than ABBA and Bruce Springsteen. And so he moved to Finland for several months to just tour and perform there. Easily the most popular of all the bands here is Teddy and the Tigers. And there was a teen trio from Carava, and they had a British producer, Richard Stanley, who was living in Finland, produced the Hurricanes Roadrunner album and some of the iconic rock albums of Finland. And he produced their first record, inspired by the movie American Graffiti and that character Terry Tiger. They decided to name their band Teddy and the Tigers with a slight twist. And their first album went #2 in Finland in December of 1978. And it starts with a tune called, and that's at the top left, the Burn It Up album. And then their next album went #3 in Finland, and that's the one at the bottom, the Rockabilly Rebel. Let's see if I can't figure out how to play for you a snippet so you can hear the Tigers. Oh my goodness. Apologize for the trip. Let's go back to sharing a slideshow. Oh, we were listening, weren't we? Did you guys hear the soundbite?
We started to, yeah, first few seconds.
First few seconds only. All right, let's see the Tigers. So that was the #2 album in Finland in 1978. And there were a whole bunch of others that followed. Hundreds of other bands during the era, and I would love to play all of them for you, but I'll pick just a couple. There was Kari Heimonen's Rebel Record Company was profoundly influential during the early years. Here we go. No. There we go. Now we're back. Profoundly influential was this Rebel Records label by Kari Heimonen, and he put out
screen, Nate. I'm sorry.
What's that?
We still can't see your screen.
You can't see my screen. Oh, how do I make that happen? I would let's see. I will go here, and then I will go here. Yeah. And I'll share sound too. And I'll share that. Is that any?
There we go.
We're back on track?
Indeed.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. So there was a bunch of other important and cool records coming out of this time, which I actually need to now exit my screen now that I'm sharing, because I want to play some of it for you. I will play probably my favorite of the Rebel records was Kitty Lee's cover of Sid King and the Five Strings. This is her doing Booger Red, and we can go here.
Well, it's red, 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 booger red, 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 booger red, 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 booger red, 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 booger red. His eyes are green, his hair is red. Booger red, booger red, booger red, booger red. He's 6 feet 5, a man alive. He often ramps to glue and drive. He never stops to look at the clock. All he wants to do is rock. His eyes are green, his hair is red. Booger red, booger red, booger red, booger red. He's got to rock it when the sun goes.
Another fun record that is up there, Buck Jones and Teddy Guitar. Teddy Guitar was from Teddy and the Tigers, formed a duo in 1981 and put out a record that they recorded in California called Hillbilly Boogie.
Well, I have a fella from Alabama way. He plays the boogie, but it's the sort of way he's got no piano. Nate to the bar, but he picks up the boogie. His own guitar plays the hillbilly boogie, any low down way. Well, he can play the boogie, play it for me any old day. Listen, all the fellas, since the gal's kinda cold, they don't love me, I think you too. Make for wrong, don't go there tonight. Play the hillbilly boogie, then I do alright. Play the hillbilly boogie, any low down way. Well, he can play the boogie, play for me any old day.
Yeah. Buck Jones was one of the first in Finland to incorporate slapped upright bass, and they formed Buck and Teddy Guitar with Rockola formed a super group called the Lone Stars. You can see them in the middle there, and that's a great record as well. It's all cool, but you might be thinking, why would all of this English language music of obscure 1950s American rockabilly tunes be played by Finns in their early teens or early 20s, many of whom were just starting to learn the English language? Why would this become the most popular music in all of the country? And if you're wondering that, you're not alone. I was too. Particularly because Finnish music papers, when they began publishing top 10 charts in 1951, they were dominated by Finnish artists who sang in Finnish. And Pekka Gronau, Ilpo Saunio, they wrote that throughout the 50s, domestic records outsold imports considerably. And even by 2012, Finland was one of the few European countries where domestic records outsell imports. But according to Mika Murulainen, the percentage of domestic sales was around 60% and in 2012. And that leaves a lot of room for American music to come into Finland. And according to rockabilly musician Buck Jones, who we just heard, as record players became prominent in Finland, nearly every Finnish home had some American popular music in it. And he told me that in the 60s, in most Finnish homes, there were maybe 5 albums and a couple of Finnish Finn hits compilations. Then there was Elvis and Johnny Cash, and there was Jerry Lee Lewis, and later came the Hurricanes, the first real band in Finland to use English language, and that was a really great band. By the mid-70s, the first rock star in Finland, Rock Jerry, recorded 2 new albums in 1975 and 76 of rockabilly material. And Jussi Raittinen, who was in one of the first popular rock and roll bands, Eero and Jussi and the Boys, and then later the Sounds, came to the States in 1976 and recorded a rockabilly album in California and a country music album in Nashville, Tennessee. And it's worth noting that in 1977, Elvis Presley passed away, and there was sort of an international revival of Elvis's early music that was happening too. But as Buck Jones said, the most popular predecessor in Finland for this phenomenon was the Hurriganes, or the Hurricanes. And music researcher Kare Avaro says that in Finland in the early 70s, there were few restaurants, alcohol was expensive, and in the leftist art world, it was generally held that the United States was the world's threat and the Soviet Union was the bringer of peace. And also in the world of music, there were few exceptions to the rule of progressive and art rock performers for whom the idea of rocking out was to stare at their nailed to the floor shoes and demonstrate with wrinkled brow, virtuosic playing skills and long solo sections. The Hurricanes proved that although also from our own country, a rock and roll band could come along and sound just as good as their worldwide counterparts and with a great style to boot. In his book, Czechoslovakian Kuninkat, or Czechoslovakia's King, cultural historian Petru Lauka argues that the Hurricanes played the most pivotal role in bringing American music as well as American capitalistic values to Finland in the 70s. The Hurricanes, after all, were Finland's first band to feature an American flag on stage with them at all times, to drive 50s American cars and Harley Davidsons, to be sponsored by a blue jeans company, and were the first chart-topping Finnish rock band to sing exclusively in English. Their most famous song won the 1974 European Pop Jury Contest, beating out Eric Clapton and Mud and Sweet, and is largely considered one of the greatest rock and roll songs from Finland. Let's see if we can't hear it. I think most people probably know it already, but if you haven't heard it.
Well,
That's pretty great. If ever I need to smile, I just need to listen to that song. It's so good. The lyrics, they lack overall consistency or maybe coherency. But what is clear from that song is the influence of 1950s American rock and roll, an admiration for the names of Southern states in the English language, a desire to play the band's part to align themselves with Western symbolism, and a fan's desire to align themselves with that same identity. At a time of political unrest, when the nation's press were self-censoring all criticism against the Soviet Union, when the country felt a palpable fear of Soviet invasion, and when the Soviet Union had banned rock and roll music, they hadn't had the first public rock and roll festival in the Soviet Union was in 1980. This was a rock and roll band just across the border who openly and boldly flaunted the American flag and Western allegiances. And it wasn't just in music that this was happening in the late 70s. In movies, it was also quite clear. Movies were monumentally influential, and I did 48 interviews for my dissertation, and I talked with hundreds more, and almost everybody I talked with mentioned the movie American Graffiti, or Svengi Yengi 62. And author Jani Salmi says that the actual trend of all of this American stuff in Finland could be traced to February 7th, 1975, the premiere date of American Graffiti in Helsinki. But I watched the movie while I was in Finland because I had never seen it. And it takes place in the 60s and not the 50s. And there is no rockabilly music in the film at all. And Pekka Laine explained to me, it's a generational thing, quote, it's a wider cultural phenomenon also about discovering a new world in the middle of a bleak and semi-depressing cultural atmosphere that was in Finland in the 70s. It was about finding highly stimulating and exciting imagery, a make-believe version of history with a distorted and almost fetishistic emphasis on certain aspects of the popular culture that is quite far from a real America. It was a gateway drug, so to speak. It was a major factor in the wave of other influences that pushed one generation into the world of vintage Americana and its British mutations. And it was about discovering rock and roll, which is much bigger than rockabilly. Rockabilly is a small piece of the puzzle. And while American Graffiti had profound impacts on Finnish music and fashion and consumerism and taste, there were other movies like American Hot Wax, Grease, Grease 2, Buddy Holly, and more. And the Elokuvarkisto in Helsinki, which showed archival movies, was also doing rock and roll movies around the clock. So Tapio Väisänen remembered going there and seeing Blackboard Jungle, The Girl Can't Help It, Rock Around the Clock, Wild One, and others. And he told me that in the 70s, we were looking for the 50s music, and everyone was taking something from it. The leather jackets and greased hair and the style, which was in all these movies. And I do want to be careful with the use of the word America. I'm talking not about the Americas generally, or even North America, but specifically the United States, and more specifically, mass cultural byproducts produced in the United States that reflect the mid-1950s that were exported to Finland in the 1970s. It happened in music, it happened in film, it also really happened a lot in television. Yleis Radio, Yle was the national broadcasting company, and they first broadcast in Finland in 1957. And from a very early point, became an outlet for mainstreaming American images and lifestyles to Finnish public. According to Visa Heinonen and his researchers, they produced an article called How Lifestyle Products Became Rooted in the Finnish Consumer Market. And in the late 50s, 67% of Finnish TV programming originated from the United States. And in 1963, that percentage exceeded 70%. And among the most popular TV shows in the 60s for Finnish youth was Western show Bonanza, and in the 70s, it was Happy Days. And like most Nordic countries, the TV content in Finland used subtitles for translations instead of overdubbed voices used by a lot of countries in Europe. So the TV became a primary source for Finnish youth to learn and practice English language as well. And as my friend Mika Murulainen told me back then, if something broke really big, no matter what kind of music, it was really big. There was no internet. There were only 2 channels on the TV, and they only broadcast from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. So whenever something was available, let's say not the whole nation, but it was easy to reach all of the people in Finland through those few channels. And not just TV programming, but also advertising was particularly Americanized. And of course, consumerism itself is not an American ideal, but that Heinonen article I cited from 2003, they noticed that American-styled ads were utilizing the imagery of the United States to make things seem cool and modern and desirable. And they noted that Yankee gum, spelled like Yankee, but it's Yankee chewing gum, for commercials showed American cars and motorcycles and beautiful women and American policemen and Native Americans and gasoline stations and Greyhound buses and modern day drifters in cowboy clothes. All were wearing sunglasses, all chewing on Yankee and making it cool, end quote. The goal of advertising firms was to make America cool, and it worked. According to my friend Pekka Laine, we had a conversation where he said TV was a drag back then. You come home from work, you put on the TV, and now we'll have a 3-part documentary about air pollution. Next, we'll be looking into the situation in Northern Lapland and how to fix our reindeer economy. And I said, but I thought you were watching Happy Days. And he said, exactly, that's the point. If this is your standard, and then somebody shows you Happy Days is amazing. When you have a lack of something, you are thirsty for something. Then when you get it, you really drink it. And then cars. According to folklorist Tom Odell, the American car is perhaps the symbol par excellence of American society, the legendary basis for so many stories about American ideals of freedom and escape. And the American car is often held up as more or less the epitome of all mass-produced, mass-consumed objects, end quote. Excluding the United States, I was told on several occasions, there are more classic American cars from the 50s and 60s in Scandinavia than in any part of the world, and Finland holds a large percentage of them. As I attended custom culture conventions for hot rods and classic car customization, American car shows, hot rod inspired art exhibits, as well as the frequent Friday night American cruise nights in Helsinki held every month during the summer, it felt rather plausible suggestion. According to Mala Mock, editor of Kopteri magazine, the 50s rock and roll digging was very US oriented. Like everything cool in the 50s came from the US. And it was also this time that Finnish hot rodding became popular. All those things were together. The Hurricanes drove a 55 Cadillac. Teddy and the Tigers had their mid-60s Dodge Monaco. Then there was the fact that the Soviet Union had their hands in our own domestic politics quite a bit back in the 70s. So believe it or not, it was rebellious to drive American cars and show the flag of the United States, end quote. This American fad also spills over to fashion, which is an obvious way that American influence would permeate Finnish culture. It was and always is connected to music. According to folklorist Pravina Shukla, we all dress to accommodate social and environmental factors and to reflect our personal aesthetics and identities. And in doing so, quote, clothing is a palpable, immediate, and intimate form of material culture, which calls attention to standards, acts of desire, and the forces of consumption and social response, end quote. Shukla's definition emphasizes the role of consumerism and as we form personal identities, and it's the role of those choices in social formation and acceptance. And as American roots music and popular music grew in popularity, so too did American fashion. As a means of social bonding, blue jeans in particular became symbols of freedom in America and youth rebellion in Finland. And when I asked my friend Jussi Huttukangas, why did he get into this American roots music in the first place? He said, well, Elvis just looked so cool. Big American cars, pinball machines, jean jackets, beautiful women, beaches. It was so new and different. And of course, the last thing we wanted to look like was to look like Russians. I also found sports an interesting place for America to seep into Finland. American football came to Finland in the 70s and remains active today. One of the regular Goofin customers was a coach and a player for the Helsinki Roosters. American basketball has been increasing in popularity since the 70s, made more popular by the draft pick of Lauri Markkanen a few years ago. And used to be able in the 70s to buy playing cards of Finnish sports stars and American sports cars together. And I have some of those, which are fun. And the sport, what else? Oh yeah, I do love bringing this up. This is a picture of a Pesäpallo game. And I love that the national sport of Finland is not hockey, but it's baseball. Pesäpallo is sort of a Finnish inversion of baseball, but it's very much inspired by baseball, and it was showcased at the 1952 Summer Olympics in Helsinki. Food's an interesting one too. Though it's moved a little slower than some of these other influences. McDonald's has been in Finland since 1984. Subways are everywhere there since 2000. There's 31 subways in Helsinki, and when you decide to get cookies instead of chips, you only get one cookie instead of two like you do in the States, which I thought was an interesting difference. But it was while I was living there doing this dissertation research in 2012 that Burger King first opened in Finland, and then the next year, 2013, is when Finland got their first Starbucks. So to focus back on this sort of Cold War era, 78 to 82 era, I think it's also worth mentioning that the boom happened at the same time that Finnish teens first had pocket money, and Finland was becoming more industrialized. And according to this 8-part centennial history of Finland, which was published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, they reported that by the 80s, the Finnish economy had boomed. People were optimistic about the future. The country developed a prosperous society. There was a strong emphasis on the Nordic welfare state. People had more money than ever before. They used it to buy property, to travel, to start new hobbies like windsurfing and downhill skiing. Credit was cheap. Wages were improving. It's all positive news here. Finns celebrated consumerism, took large loans, and admired American yuppies. Public spending grew rapidly and the economy overheated, which is an interesting summation of this era. So my point in highlighting this is that Americanisms exist in many corners of the world, in the sense that McDonald's and Hollywood movies and Levi's and Elvis Presley records are pretty common in many countries. The globalization of American popular culture, as the seminar that led to the formation of American Studies back in 1947 was titled, has been hotly debated for a long time. And the questions, is America forcing its goods and politics on unsuspecting cultures across the globe, or are these products and lifestyles and images reflecting a need on the part of the receiving consumers? And early studies of Americanization equated this spread of American pop culture to sort of a cultural globalization that would be, I guess Alan Lomax called it cultural gray out of all local culture. And ethnomusicologist Bruno Nettles said, quote, "If there's one commonly held fear among ethnomusicologists at cocktail parties, it is that the 20th century, we will see the complete homogenization of world music, resulting in incredible boredom and the de-employment of all ethnomusicologists," end quote. Even Finnish historian Max Jakobsen wrote that by the early 80s, in many, quote, "in many respects, lifestyles, consumer habits, fashions, television entertainment, holiday travel, Finland became indistinguishable from any other Western country. Older Finns complained that Finland had become Americanized to the detriment of traditional ties with Germany and France. And indeed, thanks to generous scholarship programs, the American influence in Finnish cultural life had become dominant," end quote. Historian Lane Crothers talks about this popular culture as the central issue in the 50-year political and military standoff between the US and the Soviet Union. Broadly generalizing, the Western Alliance stood for personal liberty, and the like a means to personal liberty, like achieving happy, productive citizens, benefiting the majority, and the East argued for government control as a means to ensure equality and basic needs are met for all. And it's, I think, important to understand the rockabilly explosion in this Cold War context. In the mid to late 70s, many Finns didn't want to poke the bear, quote, or take part in activities that they felt might provoke their Soviet neighbors. And others felt like they wanted to be part of the West and should welcome the American influence. Those who saw, some saw America as a beacon of hope, and they could point to America's freedom, democracy, liberation, modernity, and all of the cultural influences mentioned above. It had a cool factor. I have quite a few quotes here, but I'll just trim it down because I want to wrap it up and have time for questions in a short bit. But Ape Niemi from Teddy and the Tigers emphasized this American cool factor, telling me that I think very much we were overwhelmed by the culture of how we saw the US as a country. We got a lot of influence from there and accepted most things. If it's from the US, it's cool. Not everybody agreed, and it's important to note that in Finland. As easy as it can be to marvel at the American cultural machine and its commodified output and global transmission, it can be easily criticized. For many Finns, particularly in the late 60s and 70s, America represented warmongering, unsuccessful and necessary war in Vietnam, a mindless mass culture for the lowest common denominator society, petty consumerism at best, cultural imperialism that decimated Finnish cultural heritage at worst. Multiple groups emerged at this time which outwardly opposed the American influence in Finland. Finnish philosopher George Henrik von Wright criticized America in a well-known article published throughout Scandinavia in November of '67, and immediately following that letter, an anti-Vietnam War movement spread across Finnish university students where anti-Americanism was on the rise, and the Finland-Vietnam Society, founded in 1971, became a prominent voice in that movement. And as that Heinonen article that I cited earlier, the Finnish peace movement, the strengthened political left, and the rising student movement were particularly critical of the United States. Critical voices had been heard from the late 60s onwards, but came to a head in the mid 70s. And there were a lot of folks who I talked with, part of this American music boom, American roots music boom, who said that their music wasn't political. Some of the other punk rock music and popular genres were very political. They were not about politics. And they expressed to me that their love for it was just for the music, not for the politics. But this East-West divide was at least in people's minds as they were adopting a social group and making aesthetic choices. For my friend Pete Hawkinen, I skipped that quote, so that doesn't make sense now. So I'll skip that. But for many, it was a difficult choice to make. To decide what group and what kind of music to follow. My friend, radio DJ Tapio Martlar, had one of the most popular rockabilly radio programs in the entire country called Rock and Rolling Vuodet, or the Wild Years of Rock and Roll. And he told me, quote, "At the time in the 70s, the whole country was very political. We had a strong left political movement with the young people. For instance, in the university, students were very much right or left, nothing in between, but also my show was on Yle E radio, and we had two radio stations then, Radio 1 and Radio 2. Radio 1 was right, Radio 2 was left, and all the employees who were working there, you had to choose if you wanted to be on the right or the left side. I didn't want to. I was somewhere in between all the time. So we had two unions for freelance workers, one for the left, one for the right. I didn't join either because I couldn't choose, but I worked for Radio 1, and it was for the right, politically oriented people. And I think in Radio 2, it would not have been possible to play these American rockabilly songs because they were too American. Maybe they were unpolitical, but as the left was saying, if you're not with us, you are against us. As I have tried to show, consuming and wearing Americana and listening to 50s American music was in fact a conscious choice, often an unavoidable one, and one that was not independent from social ramifications. While many of the Finnish language lyrics and punk music were expressly political, calling out social injustice and blind consumerism, English language Finnabilly lyrics were noticeably less political, but still in English. And the music was tied to a social movement that led to the creation of an imagined America that emphasized positive values of America, such as freedom, rebellion, independence, and wild entertainment. And that is, to say the least, political. So my primary argument is this. In Finland in the 70s, whichever music one liked, whichever fashion one wore, whichever movies one emulated, those actions bonded individuals to a social network, and that social bond carried political weight. In this way, Finnabilly music was fundamental in forming and sustaining a social group that consumed and perpetuated a positive image of America. And while some of my friends in the Finnabilly community have suggested that they were just buying what was sold to them, I prefer to give them some agency. Popular music historian Diane Pecknold, in her study of how authenticity in country music is fabricated, suggests that music consumerism is tied to an ideal, imagined, or alternate reality. She says, quote, "Our understanding of how country and popular music more generally is produced and received can be enriched by exploring how commercialism itself may become a way of expressing deeper emotions and hopes harbored by the listeners," end quote. Pecknold talks about how country music is marketed here in the United States as a symbol of consumer democracy. And to a large extent, that's how I see American roots music in Finland. It's a financial choice individuals were free to make, and it represented their hopes and aspirations. It also means that there's some really great music out there. I am running out of time, so I don't even know how much I can play for you. I really, there's so many great tunes. Let's see. Because as time has gone on, some people left the scene, some people joined the scene, but the bands have gotten better over the years to the point that now Finnish rockabilly and American roots music groups are really among the best in the entire world. And there's just so much great stuff. Here's a cool track.
All we need is a flat top guitar and an F-style mandolin. Big old bunky doghouse and a Gibson RB3. We'll get the hound up barking and you want some fiddles to lead. We'll play our round of bluegrass from Viber to LA. From the town of Viber, Finland to the good old USA. From Helsinki, Chile sidewalks to the red hot Georgia plain. From Carolina to Karelia, on back to California. We play our brand of bluegrass from Viber to LA.
Yeah. And it wasn't too long ago that I got to do a radio program on Finnabilly music, and I got to play this as the first track. I love it.
Whiskey River, take my mind. I don't let a memory torture me. Now Whiskey River, don't I try.
Yeah, I do want to play a whole bunch of this music. Maybe we have time. We can come back and just play some tunes, which would be great. But I want to finish my closing argument, which is that Finnabilly phenomena during the Cold War provided a myriad of ways for Finnish youth not to just consume their vision of America, but to study it, shape it, perfect it, perform it. It glorified aspects of America, ignored others, inspired thousands of Finnish youth to explore life in the West and write songs about it. And as time went on, some of the best bands in the world emerged from this scene. Finland joined the European Union in '95, and open trade in the EU allowed independent record businesses to survive in tougher economic times. And with increasing sales of records, Finnish bands were now touring outside of Finland, and many international bands were looking to Goofen Records and other Finnish labels like Blue Light Records or Jungle Records to release their music. And throughout the 90s, Goofen's international reputation grew. As Pekka Laine told me, quote, at some stage in the 90s, all the Goofen bands like the Barn Shakers, who we just heard, really started getting better and better and started touring abroad, and they were playing all the big events in the States and in the UK, and Goofen Records was sort of leading the way, and you could see the fruits of the whole thing coming up. It was like, hey, these guys can really play. It would have been impossible to imagine in 1981 that a Finnish band would sound as good as they sound. The evolution of the culture got deeper and deeper, and now they truly have a great understanding of the nuances of the music. And Finland has been in this process of being Americanized since its inception, and particularly through the Cold War. But did Finland actually become Americanized? Was the cultural gray out so strong that Finland is now indistinguishable from America? I would say obviously no. Though today Finland is filled with dozens of Americana shops, and they are more often than not marketed as 50s shops or weird antique shops or women's pinup boutiques or American rock and roll record stores. One of the largest 50s pinup clothing shops in the world is in Somero, Finland. And you can walk into, what is that right there? You can walk down the streets of Helsinki to find garage land selling still Confederate flag patches and flags and Dickies jeans, and go to Tampere and go to Nitro Boy and buy 50s American inspired clothes, and then stroll over to Finlayson Factory in a 50s themed classic American diner and drink a 10-euro milkshake. And you can also check out that Finnabilly gig guide and just see tons and tons of Finnabilly gigs. These were all inspired by a Finnish interpretation of America, and yet I would suggest that you can't walk down the streets of Madison, Wisconsin and find those same things. And if you keep walking down the streets of Finland, you'll find folks taking in public sauna and jumping into freezing lakes and making and eating pulla and spending summers on holiday, standing in grilly lines to wait for makara sausage, which you eat without a bun, drinking thick yogurt juice for breakfast, enjoying extended health care and free college education and maternity and paternity leave with mandatory military service, and kids dressed as witches and hitting each other with sticks for Easter, and a lot of the things that make Finland more Finnish than America. So today I've reviewed several of the ways in which Finnabilly members reimagined 1950s America in the 70s and in the early 80s, and how that American influence combined with Soviet fear and Finnish censorship, as well as an economic boom, contributed to the roots music boom. And throughout that process of Americanization, Finland never did lose Finnishness or become culturally homogenous, but I would argue that the consumption and performance of Finnabilly music provided Finnish youth with the means to articulate specific westward-leaning political, social, and cultural desires that were otherwise unavailable to them. And it could be further argued that that process of Americanization didn't turn Finland into another United States, but that the experience actually made Finland more like the rest of Europe. American studies scholar Rob Crows argues that, quote, as images of America's culture of consumption began to fill Europe's public space, they exposed Europeans to views of the good life that Americans themselves were exposed to. And to that extent, they may have Americanized European dreams and longings. But there's also a way we might argue that Europe's exposure to American imagery may have worked to Europeanize Europe at the same time. End quote. He's suggesting that many European publics were exposed to American mass culture and that the shared experience created a bond among people across Europe. And he adds that, quote, shared repertoires, shared tastes, and shared cultural memories had formed that would make for quick and easy cultural exchange across national borders among Europe's younger generations because they could readily compare notes on shared cultural preferences using the American examples as varieties of mass culture produced in their own national settings, end quote. And that's sort of where I see the proliferation of rockabilly and roots music festivals throughout Europe and this heavy participation in them by Finns, attesting to that shared common European experience. Finland maintained its independence throughout the Cold War and in 1995 joined the EU, now officially part of the West. The open door policies to citizens of other European nations it now has an increasingly diverse population, more cosmopolitan citizenry, and as Guffen Records owner Pete Hakanen says, quote, it was a different world then in the 70s, but Finland is completely different now. After we joined the EU, I feel that we are free. That's my talk right on the DOT. We're at 12 o'clock. That's kind of what I'm researching. That's what I'm talking about. There's a lot of other parts of my research that I'm writing about, including the Confederate flag, of course. But that gives you an idea about the Americanization aspect of this whole American roots and Finnabilly boom. And I would love to field some questions if anybody has any.
Thanks for that, Nate. That was fantastic. We do have a bunch of
All
questions.
right, sweet.
Which is great. So we'll start working through them here.
All right.
The first one is actually a request for resources. It's a recognition that this talk was not, of course, about the Confederate flag in Finland, but we've had a couple people ask if there are resources where they can learn more about the Confederate flag in Finland.
Yeah. Well, I think probably my dissertation is the place that I would send people, and it's published. You can find that on ProQuest. If you have access to ProQuest, which is, you can also purchase it if you don't have a university affiliation through that website. But I am hoping to turn my dissertation into a book, and that will, of course, include, I was trying to document the history of the Confederate flag here in the States, and then as it became a popular cultural symbol through football games and through music, and as that went through the UK and was sort of filtered in the UK rockabilly scene, and then spread throughout to the rest of Europe. And it has taken on a life of its own in Finland, particularly because a lot of places like the Ruhijärvi Rockabilly Festival have abandoned the Confederate flag. They used to hang a massive one, like 18 feet high, a giant Confederate flag. And now the last time I was there 4 years ago or something, they stopped showing that flag. And when I played there, they knew that I was American and wouldn't want to be photographed with it. So they had me play outside, and all the other bands played inside with that Confederate flag as a backdrop. So there's folks who are thinking about it, addressing it, making changes right now. And there's also folks who fiercely defend their right to wear it, and that it's a symbol of rock and roll and rockabilly music. And it's part of their youth and a strong nostalgia pull for that flag. I was sort of advised when I was thinking about what I was going to do with this paper that I probably shouldn't get too into the weeds on semiotic and assimilative perspectives on Americanization and the Confederate flag. So I decided not to go there. But I would be happy to discuss it with anybody. Just a couple years ago, almost every major rockabilly festival in the world banned the Confederate flag. But you see it in Finland now paired with the Finnish national flag and the Confederate flag as sort of a far right call to arms. And so it's sort of taken on new meaning.
Thanks, Nate. And I will get a link into the chat to your dissertation for people in just a second, but we'll get you started on the next question then.
All right.
There's a request here to know a little bit more about these festivals, right? Do they include typical 50s style dancing as well as the music? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, dance is such an important part of all of this, and I really wish I could have included more of that in this presentation too. Dance as part of like mating rituals, right? Like people go to dances to meet people and to socialize, and that's a big part of this scene. There's usually swing dance instructors at all of these things. So there's definitely a lot of dancing, which is coupled with the stereotype of American cool and that sort of James Dean aesthetic where like the guys don't dance and it's not cool to dance. And so you have this real half the crowd loving dancing and just being part of it, and also a lot of people too cool for school. But I unfortunately don't delve as much into dance. I couldn't do it today. What was the other part of that question? It was
just a little bit more about the festivals themselves.
Yeah, there are so many. I don't know. There are many festivals. That Helsinki Rockabilly Week thing doesn't exist anymore. Turns out a lot of bands were scammed out of money, and the person didn't pay a lot of people and never threw another one. But other festivals continue on. The Ruhijärvi Rockabilly Festival is still quite popular and is awesome, and in the middle of the countryside, a few hours drive from Helsinki. Big wheels in Pieksämäki with a lot of American car shows. And yeah, the festival scene in Finland is really incredible. And I think that's partly because you get a couple nice months of weather and everybody just books tons of great festivals and shows. Sort of like Madison, where we have festivals every weekend in the summertime, but then not a lot of festivals out of that. I think they're all kind of bunched in the summertime. So in my short, I was in Finland for maybe 8 weeks that first summer, but I went to tons of festivals and it was pretty great.
That's great, thank you. There's also a question about Leningrad cowboys and kind of this, that there's some roots in reality. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's the Leningrad cowboys are hilarious, and anybody who has seen those Aki Kaurismäki movies, Leningrad Cowboys Go America, which have these sort of exaggerated pompadours, and it's just how big can your shoes get, how big can your hair get, and it's sort of a parody of very much an experience that people in Finland are familiar with. I think this whole rockabilly thing is funny in a sense that everybody in Finland knows about rockabilly and about this American music boom. If you go to any library in the United States, there are sections for rockabilly music. And when I was there, I would hear radio ads that parodied rockabilly people. And I would see, there's another movie called The Rumble Movie, which is similar to, it's like the Finnish version of the Finnish film about the Leningrad Cowboys, just about a parody of this sort of rockabilly and American roots music culture, maybe a little harsher than Leningrad Cowboy stuff is. But I love that band. And if anybody has not seen the trilogy of Leningrad Cowboy movies, I highly recommend them all. Yeah, super funny group. I don't know what else to say about them.
That's great, thanks.
They were not part of, I interviewed almost all the people that I talked about today. I interviewed Jussi Raitinen and Eero and Teddy Guitar and Ape Niemi from Teddy and the Tigers and Rock Ola and Buck Jones, and all these folks were part of my dissertation research, but I did not get to I guess I did interview Tokala, who was a member of the Leningrad Cowboys for a brief period, but I didn't get, they weren't part of my research sphere.
That's awesome. Could you, real quick, could you put up the slide with the great music that you didn't get a chance, so people can kind of write down some?
Oh yeah, these were just some of my favorite songs that
Yeah, that's awesome.
If I could make I'm really opposed to Spotify in every sense of the word, but if I wasn't, I would make this a playlist and share it with people.
That's great. We got a bunch more questions, and they're such fantastic questions, so I'm going to keep shooting them at you here, I guess. We've got a question here from Ruth Olson. Curious about how much influence Finnish Americans had on Finnish culture in the 70s and 80s. Was there a lot of travel by Finnish Americans to Finland? Did they kind of transport mass culture like t-shirts, blue jeans as gifts, for example?
That's interesting. You know, when I think about music in Finland, there's obviously a hugely, profoundly important starting point, which is all of the Finnish American recordings that were made here in the United States at a time when recordings couldn't be made in Finland in the 1920s. And those recordings were exported to Finland, and a lot of folks listen to that, those music, you know, Hiski Salama and a lot of others. That music continually gets reissued in Finland and was resonant with a lot of folks in Finland. So there was that sort of early influence of Finnish Americans in Finland musically. And then folks like Eddie Boyd, the great Chicago blues man, moved to Finland in the late 60s and performed throughout there. And there were, I don't know, I think that there's always been various streams of cultural influence for sure. When I was there were a lot of American musicians living in Finland. Six Gun Republic, Chansey and all those guys were there. I can't even start naming folks, but there were a bunch. Yeah, but I do think there has been a lot of folks carrying music and cultural entities from the States to Finland for a long time. And I was a grad student when I was doing all this, and every year after my dissertation research, I would always return to Finland, which is very hard to do when you make $5,000 a year as a grad student. And to keep going back to Finland, my way to do that was just to scour record stores for 50-cent and $1 records and load up on tons of records and bring them over to Finland with me and sell them. And it would pay for my plane ticket and my food and whatnot, and then come back. And so I was dumping a lot of American rockabilly music into Finland as well. That I do think a lot of folks were doing that for sure. I don't know if that answers your question, Ruth, but.
That's great. I think it's important to remember how, you know, we are also doing this. We're bringing our own culture when we go, you know, conduct research and all that. You had mentioned Elvis a couple times, and some of the people you interviewed had mentioned Elvis. We got another question here about Elvis impersonators, and if they've been or are as popular in Finland as they are here in America.
Yeah, there is an Elvis fan club that's quite huge. And one of the first shows I ever went to Finland was to see Rock Ola, who you heard from, one of the big original stars of the Finnabilly boom. And he was performing a set of Elvis songs at an Elvis fan club tribute. I don't know if I would call it, and I saw the String Beans doing something there, like an Elvis tribute set. I never saw an Elvis impersonator, but a lot of Elvis tributes and folks who really love Elvis. And there was a section when I was volunteering at the Goofin record store. I think Elvis and the Stray Cats keeps that place in business, because every week there's a new Elvis reissue, and it boggles my mind that they can come up with new ways to package his music, even though he passed away in 1977, and people would come in and buy them. A lot of people would come in and buy those new reissues. So there's still a lot of people who love Elvis in Finland, but I didn't actually see Elvis impersonators per se.
Thanks. Go ahead, Anna. Sorry.
I was just going to jump in, since we're talking about these sort of musical juggernauts from the US. You'd sort of also mentioned or alluded to British musical influences too. And we had a question about whether the British invasion or the Beatles specifically had a similar influence in Finland.
I think earlier, for sure, the Beatles would have been popular. And one of the cool things that the Beatles did for a lot of folks around the world was to help people get away from individual performers and focus more on bands. And that was, I think, one of the great contributions of the British invasion. But in the 60s in Finland, I think Rautalanka and surf and sort of the instrumental band thing would have been more popular than the British invasion. Like bands like the Sounds in Finland were quite popular. Yeah, if it were Elvis versus Beatles in Finland, I think Elvis would sell more records for sure. I think Elvis wins. But the Beatles are great. Good band.
We've had a couple of questions, kind of thinking through different levels of.
Can I cut you off real quick, Marcus? Yeah. I do think probably a more profound influence from England would have been that a lot of this rockabilly music was actually popular in England before it became popular in Finland. So there was a massive rockabilly and American roots music explosion in England that predates this and sort of tied into teddy boy culture in the UK in the early 70s and mid 70s. And a lot of the DJs from England who were going to the US in the late 60s and early 70s were taking all of these records and bringing them over to the UK and then distributing throughout Europe. And that probably had a more profound impact on this music than the Beatles did. But DJs like Breathless Dan Coffee and Wildcat Pete and probably more the DJ culture had a bigger impact than the band. That would be my hot take. Go ahead, Marcus, sorry.
No, that's great. There's been a bunch of questions asking about, you know, the way Americanization, American music, all this stuff has influenced different things. And we've got a question here, excuse me, looking at that in kind of a bigger picture, noting that, you know, there's this mass imagination throughout the world that the United States is this kind of 50s and 60s, right? This is what people often associate it with. You mentioned the cars, the diner chains, and the music, of course. But it also ends up in different places. It's not just Finland, right? So we've got it as far away as Australia, and as well then as the 1950s being, as this person writes, a surprisingly popular decade in the image of America, with hand-picked elements like milkshakes, rock, tail fin cars, cute waitresses, but without the real problems of the 50s. You don't have the racism, the atomic war paranoia, etc. Could you comment a little bit on that in terms of, you know, you framing it within the context of the Cold War and all of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's at the heart of it, right? So this massive boom happened in Finland, but it wasn't embraced by everybody. And I would venture to say that it was probably pretty evenly split, with people who hated this music just as much as people who loved it. And there were a lot of people who despised this sort of glorification of a mutated, imaginated version of America that was nothing like what they saw the US as. And I refrained from using some of the quotes from some of the folks I interviewed who really downplayed America and talk about how it's this horrible warmongering place that of gun nuts and religious zealots and painting this very negative picture of America. But that there are those thoughts that are there, and that is part of, and I didn't have time to get too into it, but that's part of why this whole scene was actually a pretty violent culture in the 70s. And there were a lot of fights, and there were a lot of gang wars and turf wars that were territorial, but also largely based on your social group. You're a punk, I'm going to beat you up. Or you're a hippie, or you're you're a college Vietnam protester and I'm going to beat you up, or I'm going to get beat up because I'm somebody who just loves America and sings in English and is not thinking critically about those implications. And so a lot of people left the scene because it was too violent. But there were fights at a lot of these shows. And so I don't mean to paint a rosy picture of all this Americanization. I think it gave voice to a group of people who couldn't otherwise express their desires to align with Western values and Western ideals, but that came at a cost that was also creating a somewhat violent and dangerous community for many. That's also one of the many nuances that don't fit into a 1-hour presentation, but yeah, very much a contested front for sure.
Thanks for that. We've got another question here about the Nordic roots music of the 90s, and wondering if that's kind of a reaction to the Finnabilly Americanization or Europeanization, as you have argued also.
I guess I would need more examples or more specifics to address that question.
I will let then the question asker, Robert, maybe you can add some things to the chat for a little bit more there. There's another question here about a musician, unclear a little bit on the first name, maybe Mikko or Mika Alatalo, who wrote and performed a sort of country music that spoke to the Finns who went to Sweden. And Marianne writes that more recently, this was happening in the 90s and early 2000s, he was hosting a mainstream summer outdoor music series with sing-alongs that were shown on TV. Does his music career have any connection to kind of this Finnabilly, or is this something a little bit separate?
I see them as separate. I wish I knew Mikko Alatalo's music a little better than I do. I associate him with sunglasses and politics. And I know that he's also performed at FinnFest in the past as well. And it's just, as I see Finnabilly defined as a community, I don't necessarily see him as part of that community. But whether or not some of his recordings were influenced by American roots music, I think that argument could very much be made. Just something that was just beyond the scope of my project. I didn't get to meet or talk with Mikko Alatalo, so I don't know.
Nate, you mentioned maps and I missed something here. The Americanization, Europeanization slide that you had a map of Europe. Did the colors, someone asked here if the colors of the map meant anything, or was that just to differentiate the different countries?
Oh man, my friend Tim Barney, I was thinking about this recently because I just read some writing by my friend Tim Barney, who is a cartographer at UVA. And he always says, every map is a lie. All maps do is lie. And I don't even know what we're talking about, but I know it was a lie. in the sense that they're portraying very limited scopes, right? So that I showed that particular map. Let's see if I can go back to that slide. I don't know if I can. Just to show a picture of, the first one I showed was just Finland zoomed in to show the extensive border, 800-mile border there with Russia and a little bit of Sweden and Norwegian borders. But then the next one I wanted to show Finland in comparison to this massive picture of Russia, or not Russia, but this massive Europe, and that it was part of that. And all of the different countries had different colors just to show that it was part of that block now. But it's all lies. All maps are.
Thanks, Nate. We're coming down here to the wire, and I noticed Robert did expand a little bit on his question, so I want to make sure that we get a chance to do that. And this might be the last one we have time for. But so again, he asked about the Nordic roots music of the 90s and if that maybe was reacting to Finnabilly or how it might be related. And he writes then, so Nordic roots music as exemplified by Varttina and emphasized and modernized these kind of traditional Finnish and other Finnish music, and bringing back the old in a new format.
Okay. I love Vartina and I love some of those groups that you're mentioning, but I see them as very different. And one of the primary differences between them is that you can go to Sibelius Academy and get a degree in folk music, and you study it and you record it and you perfect it and you tour internationally with it. And of the Finnabilly artists that I'm interviewing, Buck Jones is an exception because he has a PhD in economics, but most of these artists were folks who either didn't go or have an aversion to higher education and getting higher ed degrees in music. And they were folks who probably started playing music in their teens, just picking up guitars and forming bands when they were quite young and singing in English. And Varttina is sort of on the opposite spectrum. I think they're celebrating the history of Finnish music and taking it very seriously and getting professional training, which is a luxury that I think a lot of folks in the Finnabilly community would love to get professional music training, but it's not necessarily accessible to everyone. It's quite competitive to get those degrees and to play that specific type of music. But it does set up, and it's an interesting thought because there's, Tina Ramnarin and a lot of folks writing great books about the Nordic roots revival. And there are some parallels, but there's also a whole lot of differences. And as I was giving talks in Finland at Åbo Academy or Tampere University, a lot of folks in Finland have a real interest in Finnabilly music because it's there. Everybody in Finland knows what it is, but it's never something that's transferred over to university level discussions, or people just aren't researching and talking about it at that level. And so Marcus Monterey, who's an ethnomusicologist at Tampere, was like, oh yeah, I was a rockabilly kid with a Confederate flag on my patch when I was in school, and then completely abandoned that when I was 18 and went to college and forgot about the music altogether. And Pekka Gronau was like, oh, I know all about this music. I used to have to drive my daughter to those concerts all the time. But it doesn't really pop up in music conversations at the university level. So hopefully that will change. There seems to be a lot of interest in it. I'm giving a talk at the University of Helsinki next month about this. And hopefully there will be some more discussions in the Finnish universities about this kind of music. But I see them as pretty different than the Nordic roots boom. Happy to discuss further. There's a lot of thoughts that I could, if we had specific questions or a dialogue, we could probably expand on the similarities and differences for quite some time.
That's awesome, Nate. Thank you so much. I think we're going to have to wrap up. We've got a couple more questions, about Finnish reactions to Swedish bands, different revival movements, this sort of thing. But maybe we can ask people to check out your website, to check out some of your work, and maybe reach out to you through the Mills Music Library for some
yeah,
more.
I put my email on the first slide there, and I think we'll put make these slides accessible after this, so anybody can contact me with questions about it. The Boppers were from Sweden and part of this Finnabilly boom. ABBA, of course, was in the charts at the same time and dominating a lot of them. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions like that. My email is nathan.gibson@wisc.edu, also known as Whiskey Doo.
Great, thank you, Nate. And thank you all for being here. So our next presentation will be, this is part of a kind of Finnish Folklife series, as Anna mentioned at the beginning. Our next presentation is going to be a month from now. And that'll be Saturday, April 30th. And we're going to be joined by Gloria Johnson and Erica Suo, who are going to be actually demonstrating pola making and talking specifically then about the pola tradition in Oulu, Wisconsin. And of course, speaking of Oulu, there's been a little bit of music coming out recently. is it Karilainen's new song about Ulu, Wisconsin, I believe.
Yeah,
We'll try to get a
That's right.
link to
it's
that.
awesome.
Well, but we hope to see you all there. Again, that's April 30th, and we're going to be making some pulla and talking about the importance of foodways in Finnish America. Again, thank you so much. Thank you, Nate.
Yeah, thank you guys very much. And thank you to FinnFest.
Yeah, we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nate.